All right, well, it is 4:30, so we are going to go ahead and get started. And for those of you who are watching this recap later, we have a very small audience tonight because Dave did not think back in February when he was scheduling the dates for these about the reason why there was such a wide open chunk of time without anything on his calendar for this particular week. Go figure. I picked the week that lots of people are on Christmas break, or those who are going through to the end of the week are busy with choir concerts, band concerts, orchestra concerts, all of the above. So Phil and I are going to present this to everyone who is here, which right now is a whopping one. With another in the waiting room right now, who I will let in. But we are going to slightly modify the agenda tonight. So we're going to skip over the part that gets cut out of all of these anyway, the recap on how did things go. And that'll get us jumping a little bit ahead of schedule right into the Unit 4 overview. And when we finish tonight, which could be 6:30, but could be a little bit earlier than that. So we are grateful for those of you who are able to be here tonight, and for those of you watching the recap later, because I picked horrible dates for December, we're glad that you're catching the recap. So, welcome everybody. I'm wearing a Santa hat tonight because it is right around the holiday break, and my Santa hat has Mickey Mouse ears on it because we picked these up for our Disney vacation we spent last Christmas at Disney. And I see that Elizabeth is wearing antlers today, so we're all festive. And Karen, who is also on the call today, who is donating blood while the recap is going, gets the 2023 multitasking award from the Giants team here. So welcome everybody. And with that, I'm going to launch right into the Unit 4 overview because I don't want to waste any time tonight. So, jumping over to the Unit 4 overview, Phil, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the window that has a Giants lesson up? Perfect, excellent. So, Unit 4. First up, this is the fourth unit of Giants fifth grade, and we are covering these standards, which are very similar to the standards that the last unit was centered around. And Phil and I had some conversations about this, and since there's nothing we can do about the content expectations because those are closed, it means that we have two units, the one that we did last time and this one, where you may be able to catch up some ground and cover it a little more quickly because they are covering some very similar things. And so while the theme of the last units were, hey, like, what are these colonies like as they're first getting started? Now we're going to really look at the growth of these colonies. We're going to take a look and zoom in a little bit on the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. We're also going to have a conversation tonight about how those regions are um, is bone of contention a good phrase for you, Phil? Is that because we've had some talks about the regioning piece and how some of the regions that we like to study in U.S. history aren't necessarily tied together by as many commonalities as we would normally think. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. We're definitely going to get into the daily lives of people living in these different areas. We're going to describe colonial life overall. We're going to talk about the emerging labor force. And these last two in particular, these last two standards that I'm highlighting right now, 2.3.4 and 2.3.5, they're really, really, really important concepts for a good chunk of the eighth grade course. And you guys are the fifth grade teachers, obviously not the eighth grade teachers. Phil and I will see them tomorrow night. But these two standards do a really important job of paving very important parts of the eighth grade course. So Phil and I have some activities that sort of launch into some of those things that are going to make your eighth grade teachers' lives a little bit easier. So that is Unit 4 in a nutshell. But as I zoom a little bit further in into each individual lesson, and we'll get back into these in a little bit, Lesson one, the supporting question is, what did some of the early colonies try in terms of self-government? So when we fight this Revolutionary War in Unit 6 and we create a new nation in Unit 7, We didn't arrive at these ideas in a bubble. There was a lot of, well, first of all, there were a lot of ancient philosophers that impacted the thoughts and desires of the framers of the Constitution. But there were also a lot of great experiments that took place throughout the colonies on self government and what that looks like. So, lesson one of this unit really dials into we're looking again at those three colonial regions and we're looking at the development of the labor force, but we're also looking at how some of these places governed. And we're also looking a little bit at growth and some of those early conflicts. Dr. Philip is going to talk a little bit about King Philip's War in a little bit. Never call him Dr. Phil. I learned that really early in our time working together. And Dr. Philip is pushing it a little bit too, but he's going to cover a little bit on King Philip's War and a little bit later. And we have some really, really cool stuff that we have put together that, again, helps outline some of these pieces. Leading to lesson two, we're getting a little bit more into what life was like for people living in the early colonies. And for this, we're going to jump out a lot to the Colonial Williamsburg website. And while we're not going to be sharing every single one of these activities with you tonight, because a lot of them are self-explanatory, we try to use these rollouts to do some of the more confusing pieces. The Colonial Williamsburg site is a fantastic one if you haven't been out there. And so we are going to send you to some very targeted places there, as part of getting kids to look a little bit more at what life was like in the colonies. And then when we get to that third and final lesson, what successes and failures did the early colonists face? That one's pretty straightforward. We're going to again sort of review everything we've learned on New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies, and kids will come back to the colonies game overall, which I'm going to get into in just a second here. Kids will come back to the colonies game overall, and they will solve their problem for this particular unit, and then compare it to compare their final solutions to how some of the solutions the colonists came up with during the actual time period. So that's kind of a look, bird's eye overview of Unit 4 and where you're going to go with it with students after break, of course, because this week is not a good week to introduce a new unit in your classrooms, but you will be prepared when the new year comes to launch this unit and continue telling the story of fifth grade U.S. history. And I am going to be interchangeably saying fifth grade and eighth grade both of these nights because it's US history and we're doing them back to back. And that's just how my brain works. So if I accidentally goof and say eighth grade, I know you're all fifth grade teachers. You all know you're fifth grade teachers. It's totally fine. So before I get into what we're going to do with the colonies game in this particular rollout, I am wondering what questions any of you who are here with us tonight, and welcome Sarah for joining, or welcome Sarah who just joined. What questions might you have about the overview overall? Learned very early on in the pandemic when I ask a question like that over Zoom, if I take 3 deep breaths, it not only calms me down a little bit, but gives people plenty of time to unmute. I have taken those 3 deep breaths and we're going to move right along and get into what's going on with colonies in this particular unit. So, just like last time, we're going to take a second here right up front to talk about how we're going to handle the colonies game in Unit 4. This is where things have historically started to fall apart for teachers, given the fact that, as we said before, Phil and I created a framework, not a everything that you need. So I spent a lot of time going through the colony simulation and building for this rollout and our successive rollouts. Um, you know, what I hope is going to be an explanation that gets you covered through all of this. So, I figured after last month's initial overview, we would spotlight the procedural pieces that you'll come across in the remaining units. I will highlight all of this stuff again next time because the procedures are going to be the same. But I'm hopeful this will help for those of you who are going all in with the colonies game, will help you sort of navigate the pieces there. So as a reminder, We wanted flexibility in how teachers might choose to approach this. And because we wanted that flexibility, we gave you a framework. We did not give you a step by step guide. And that's where a lot of the confusion has come in over the years. So we've made the rules to this broad because some teachers, like I said, are going to dive right in, make this a large part of their course. And just as many, if not even more, will be using it the way that it's presented in the units, and may just be doing the big issue piece. Whichever camp you fall into, we want to make sure that you are feeling good about this and that we've given you a solid springboard to go however deeply you want to go. Um, like I said, this is in the past where a lot of confusion has come in, so hopefully this will help. And one final reminder, there is no answer key when it comes to the scenarios, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So as a quick refresher, this is what we did in Unit 2. Students were given the opportunity to develop a colonist, think about what their goals might be for coming to the new world, what skills they might possess that would help them survive there, what limitations they might have. And students got broken into collaborative groups that they'll be working with for the rest of the school year. And then in Unit 3, students landed. They set up shop somewhere in the colonies. They got their first scenario that they had to sort of talk out and work through. And they built their initial supply rosters and were able to hopefully increase what they set their colonies up with. I'm hopeful you had very successful colonists who, you know, did not starve or disappear into the wilds like in Roanoke or anything like that. I'm hopeful that those were I'm hopeful that all of your students were successful in their landing. But if not, they've got a new opportunity here in Unit 4. There is no Roanoke in colonies. Even the colonies that don't do well at all are going to do well enough that they don't have to, we don't have to have the mystery of what happened to Johnny's colony. So in Unit 4, the primary question that our young colonists will be focused on is, in order to grow, what do we need to do to attract more people? This is a great question for them to explore, and it's the heart of the whole unit. We're talking about the growth of the colonies, the development of the colonies, and ideally, as these colonies grow and develop, uh, population is going to grow. So, thinking back to some of the things we've already covered in class, we also have some supporting questions that are dealing with conditions and connections. So what are the conditions in the squares around your home square? What directions are the conditions most favorable for expansion if your population is growing? And this is where you can bring connections in too, because they may want to expand closer to some other territories and they may want to think about how do we connect with some of these other colonies that have also landed in this brave new world. Remember that they're going to get a new scenario every unit, and while this one is around growth, future ones will again mirror what some of the colonists are going through in the units that we are talking about. And again, when we get to the supply roster, this is where things have started to fall apart. So last time we got you your initial supplies, and this time we are going to add to them. So let's pretend for just a second that this is one of your colonies. And at the end of Unit 3, they had 50 adults, 15 children, 16 sheep, 8 goats. We know that these aren't totally realistic numbers. There's going to be more than 50 adults, but for the sake of simplicity and the sake of not making kids' heads explode, this is where we're at. And so let's pretend that this is the supply roster at the end of Unit 3. This is now what they will start Unit 4 with. So I gave you the analogy last time of considering these sheets from the colony's handouts a check register. The difference being is that each unit, they're going to get a new one that they're going to staple on top of all the old ones. The reason you do that is because we want you to be able to go back if all of a sudden you're looking at a colony and they have like 50,000 people listed as being there, something obviously went a little bit amiss somewhere, and so it allows you to sort of backtrack and look at where they've been each unit. So these are the cards that you're going to print out for this particular one, and you're going to add to this deck every unit. This is by design. So your Northeast region is going to get thicker as we go through because you're going to keep adding cards to it. Your Middle Colonies region is going to get a little bit thicker each time through. Same deal for your Southern Colonies. And then you will always have these 3 cards that can go in any of them, that are primarily dealing with hunting. You are either going to want to section out the region specific ones, so that Northeast people are only drawing from the Northeast pile. I've also seen teachers that use a different color card for each one of these. So if you buy like those color 3x5 card decks, they can cut these out and glue them on, and Northeast region is blue, and Middle colonies is pink, and Southern colonies is yellow. So that's another way that you can handle it. So it's a little bit easier visually for kids to see. So let's say that the students in this group draw this card. Successful fishing, you pick up 50 additional units of food. At this point, you can return to your new sheet, looking at your totals from the previous unit, and let them divvy up those supplies between those food-based categories, those being sheep and goats and pigs and cows. So let's pretend for a second that this is the new sheet. Again, we're keeping the original one as a record. It would end up looking like this. Let's say they want to go from 8 goats, and out of those 50 new food units that they have, they want to give 22 of those units to I'm sorry, they want to give 14 of those units to the sheep. So now got 30. And let's say that they want to add 12 of those to goats. So poof, now you've got 20. And then let's say they want to add to their cows. So they want to double their cows with the remaining 24. So they go from 24 up to 48. So these are now the new totals that they will have going into the end of the unit. And we're going to do one more thing when we hit the unit's end. So we'll get there in just a sec. Your scenario, if you remember these scenarios, students are going to work together on the first day of colonies for each new unit to come up with their initial plan for the scenario. And this is before they've learned anything about how the colonies have grown. You're presented with this idea, kids, about how do we get things to grow, and how would you grow your colonies? How would you try to attract more people there? They're going to try to come up with their solution, and from there we move into the actual learning that takes place. We have put into the lessons multiple places where draws could happen. They are happening at good stopping spots. So oftentimes it's towards the end of a lesson, but keep in mind you only have one draw per unit. So if you did that draw, if the kids pulled from that pile at the end of lesson one, when you get to this colonies game second draw at the end of lesson two, ignore it because they've already done it. It's simply if you did not do it in lesson one, here's your next most logical opportunity to do it. This is going to be similar in most units, but I'm highlighting it in unit 4 because we definitely do it here. I think in unit 6, we only do it in lesson 1 and then we review at the very end. And that's because that whole unit's around the Revolutionary War. So I'm showcasing here that we're going to give you multiple opportunities to draw, but they're only going to do it once. At the end of the unit, remember you've got group roles, and apologies for the spelling error in this particular slide, but the end of the unit, you've got your kids with the different roles. The person who is in that colonial explorer role, who is the only person that gets to talk to others and the teacher, will present their solution to the unit scenario to the teacher or to the whole class. It's up to you how you want to run it. And then the teacher is going to weigh each group's solution in terms of that historical context and if it's feasible. So if the kids say, we're going to attract people to our colony by giving everyone a free cell phone, well, cell phones haven't been invented yet. So that's going to, not attract anybody to them because nobody knows what a cell phone is because they haven't been invented yet. So when we say there's no answer key, this is why there's no answer key to the scenarios. We just want you to think about what the colonists are going through in each unit and how your students' solutions to their major issue are comparable. So at this point, you'll have each group return to their check register one last time, and now they're going to roll die. So if the colony has grown, if you say, guess what? Your colony is growing, the students get to roll a die and multiply the results by 7. So if they were to, and 7 is the number we're using for this unit. It's in the instructions, but we'll use a different number each time around, or each unit. So if the colony is growing, they're going to roll a die and multiply the results by 7. So if, for example, I rolled a 6, I now have 42 people to allocate, and that can be between adults and children. So that is going to be 42 additional people that I'm going to add to this colony in the form of adults and kids. Just like before, I'm going to split my numbers between the adults and kids. Let's say I want 30 of them to go to the adults category, so my new number is 80. And for kids, I'm going to put the rest, which takes it up to 27. So at this point, you're going to staple this sheet to the top of the original sheet from Unit 3 for each group, and this is now where the group will start in Unit 5. Some of your kids are going to want to expand. So if they have grown, if you have determined as the teacher that they came up with a viable solution for attracting more people to their colonies, you're also going to let them roll a die. And if they roll a 6, they get to pick 3 new squares that directly surround their colony. If you roll a 5 or a 4, they get 2 squares. If they do a 3 or a 2, they get 1 square. And if it's a 1, hey, you know what? Sorry, guys, you guys don't get to go that way. You guys don't get to grow, even though you had a great solution. So it's all in the luck of the roll of the dice in this particular one. Feel free to tweak this however you need to. At this point, if you're using a print map, like some of you are, have students add the flags that they designed to each square that they're picking so that it shows the growth of their colony. If you're using a digital map, like I talked about putting it in Google Slides, for example, then have them pick their squares and then you use whatever marker you're using on that Google deck that has the map that Phil created in it. And they add to theirs. And when you get back to Unit 5, that's their territory at this point. I'm hopeful that this explained in a little more detail using some visuals some of the places that this sometimes derails. Final notes, remember, this is a framework. You're going to customize it to meet your needs. Don't overthink it. Reach out to me if you have any questions as you're in the moment, if this video didn't help. And remember that the most important part, so if you try this and you're like, Dave, this is way too complicated for my 5th graders this year, the important part is those unit by unit scenarios. So at least give kids a chance to grapple at the start and end of each unit with how they're going to tackle this scenario. Feel free to skip the supplies part if that gets cumbersome. What I would like you guys to do, and this is your after Christmas break homework, as you continue to do the colonies game, I would really like some notes about what's working well and what isn't. So when we meet again for the next unit rollout, that might be my warm-up question. So think about writing down some notes about what went well and what didn't go well so that Phil and I can tweak the game further as we need to go. But it is a framework and it will hopefully serve you well. The power of it is in making sure that kids are able to grapple with those scenarios. So, Phil, did I miss anything in my colonies refresher overview?
Not that I saw.
Okay. Well, in that case, I am going to turn things over to Phil to handle King Philip's War. So, Philip, it's all you.
Okay. Try to remember how I share this thing.
You're good. I see the brief history of the war in New England.
And now it's on the whole screen.
Correct.
We had this little glick to talk about the early conflicts. And Dave said, let's do something about the King Philip's War. And I took a look at it. And I have to admit something. I'm going to be giving you tonight 3 different things that I suspect are going to come as complete new content for each one of them. One of them is going to be very straightforward and simple and kind of based on my own personal experience in the Southeast as we're talking about the regional work down there. And we decided to put that into the second half of this session because it's very concrete, it's very straightforward, it's got a lot of photographs in it, but it's got an important message in it. The brief history of the war in New England is a much more complicated question. And I'm going to be perfectly honest that I'm willing to put up a, I don't know, $100 bounty for any teacher that wants to work with me to figure out how we can actually make this thing work. Because it addresses three different glicks in three different disciplines. It addresses a glick in the civics about how we go about organizing the way we make decisions. It addresses a history glick, and it addresses a reading glick, because it is about critical reading. So I don't know how much more background I ought to say in the abstract. I'm just going to drop you into a PowerPoint that is not designed for your kids yet. It's kind of designed for you and me so that we can talk about it. And it's about this guy here. He's a Puritan minister at the time, and he published a history of the short war just after the war ended. And you might even ask about why a Puritan minister would be interested in publishing a history of the war, but that's part of what the New England colonies were all about. Um, and that the importance of the church, and particularly the Puritan church, was a part of that. So I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Increase Mather. He was Cotton Mather's father, and they do mention Cotton Mather once in a while. He was a pastor of the North Church in Boston. You know, that's that very famous church that the steeple had the lights that Paul Revere rode from and all of that kind of thing. He was the president of Harvard College for a while, and he was a leader of the Salem witch trials, where they put a whole bunch of women on trial and killed a bunch of them, executed them, beheaded them, hung them. Not, you know, this is a kind of a complicated guy. Um, and I'm going to pull out some quotes from his book because he wrote the first history of a conflict in New England. And that makes it a primary document, and that means we can tick off one little more box in the set of glicks and so on. But here again, I'm going to stop the narrative for a second and say, I'm really looking for some advice as to how this ought to get presented. I'm going to, in the middle column of the Giants website, we put up three different ways that you could do it, but I'm open to suggestions. And like I say, this is kind of complicated. It's at the beginning of our session tonight. The stuff I'll be doing later on is a whole lot more straightforward. So the basic idea here is as we're listening to these quotes or reading them or looking at them on screen, we should think about the different ways that Pastor Mather is talking about the indigenous people around there. It could be a whole class discussion using the presentation or your modified version of the presentation, or we provide you a set of these cards that you can cut apart and you can give to individual students. And their first job is just to figure out what was that person saying back then. You know, it becomes a primary document reading activity. And each one of them is going to have one or two words that's a little bit complicated because I deliberately picked these quotes to do exactly that. Or you could make these a small group project. You could have them report back to the whole group what their quote was about. Like I say, there's a lot of different ways we can do this. So tonight I'm just going to talk about the content here. And one way you could organize the class is to start out by saying, you know, how many different ways could they be describing the native people around them? I put up a list of 5 of them. That one way you could describe the native people is that they're evil enemies. You know, they're going to try to murder us as soon as they can. Another way, which a lot of people came to North America, said these are lost souls. They have not been introduced to their Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and it is our job as ministers to try to save them. Another way is they're wild beasts. That they're not really people. They're just something that God put here to punish us. Or you could describe them as victims. Their land was stolen from them and they've been hurt. Or you could just say they're savages, that they should be moved away. Or you could have them add, you could ask your kids to add to that list. I mean, another thing that they might say about the native people is they're trading partners. You know, they're people that we're going to go and we're going to sell them things. Um, Mather didn't happen to mention that. So, like I say, you could put this list up at the beginning, or you could go right into the readings and then ask each one of them how they think that Reverend Mather is talking about it. Because Reverend Mather turns out to be kind of schizophrenic here. So, with that, consider this quote on page 5. The pious and main design of the fathers of our colony is to propagate the gospel, to spread the message of Jesus Christ among these Indians, and that the salvation of some of their souls is worth the labors of many of us. You know, how are they describing the native people here? He seems to think that are, are they enemies? Are they savages? Are they people to be saved? Now, one of my questions is this too tough a question for 5th grade, or is this one right on? I ran it very briefly in New York, but it was with a strange population. It happened to have been a group of literally a Jewish school in Williamsburg area. You know, do you think this thing would work like this? I can use some advice about that. In the meantime, on page 12 of his history, he says, at the conclusion of the day of humiliation, I think that's kind of interesting all by itself, that the Puritans would have a festival called the Day of Humiliation. Uh, the Indians fired off their guns. Discharged a volley of shot might actually be a little bit of a problem for a 5th grader, and that's part of what we want to tell them with the primary document, is that people do use different words back in the old days. But they killed one of us and they wounded others. So we sent 2 of our people to go find a doctor, and the Indians killed them. And that's how Mather said the war began. And then you want to ask your kids, how are they describing the Indians? Are they describing them as souls to be saved, as wild beasts, or as killers and terrorists? You know, what are they saying? So on page 13, the Indians killed a man as he was traveling on a road. No one can doubt the justness of our cause, since the enemies did shed the blood of one of ours before we did anything to offend them. This is, I think, a really weird statement, considering that the English colonists had stolen almost all of the good land near the ocean and the Connecticut River Valley by now. But it is a mindset of what the Puritans were all about at the time. On page 24, he said, we must make a reformation. Many of our sins are grown, especially intolerable pride in clothes and hair. And there I thought I better just define that. He went on for almost a page and a half to explain how evil it was that women were actually making their hair curly. And there's so many taverns in Boston and so many false worshipers among us. And now the day is come when the Lord is fulfilling his word. I will send wild beasts among you who shall rob you of your children, destroy your cattle. And if you're not going to pay attention to this, I'm going to have them destroy your churches. Now, how is he describing the native people around him? The fact is, he spent a lot of time preaching that the Indians were just beasts and that God had created them specifically to punish the Puritans for their sins. And then on page 35, he goes on to say there were a bunch of Indians in a fort near Narragansett. Although it was the Sabbath, we decided to attack them anyway. About 80 of them fought very well, but we at last beat them out of their fort. There were hundreds of their houses within the fort, so we set them on fire. Many old women, men, children, nobody knows how many hundreds were burned to death. I think maybe not less than 1,000 Indians died at the time. Okay, a quick card on history. After that massacre, more Indian tribes joined King Philip's War. More British towns were burned. Hundreds of refugees fled and came back to Boston and to the safe towns. Then the Mohawk tribe in New York attacked the Indians from the back. They joined the war on the side of the British. Many of King Philip's allies quit, and he was killed by another Indian, and the war ended. Having said that now, this was the first big conflict between the native people and the British colonists. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, if we really look at what happened in that conflict, we're going to be doing what social science is supposed to do, and that is to prepare citizens for dealing with things that are happening today. How do we describe what happened in Israel when Hamas attacked? Were they terrorists? Were they enemies? Were they righteous people that were simply defending, that in some ways, King Philip's War is almost a perfect microcosm for what's happening in Ukraine right now. And the news at that time was just as complicated as the news is today. So hold up your finger. How many of these different ways did Reverend Mather describe the Indians? There's 5 things on the list there. Just hold up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many of those different ways? I'm seeing a 3 and a 3. Dave, put your fingers up. Another 3. The irony is, the only way he did not describe the Indians was the way the Indians would have described themselves, and that is victims who have had their land stolen from them and decided to fight back. Okay, say, it's a complicated story, and I'm not sure how much of it you even want to teach. I am sure that I don't want 5th graders learning that King Philip's War was all about the evil Indians attacking and the righteous Puritans fighting back. In other words, I want us to know enough about what actually happened that we aren't kind of sanitizing the story of what went on back in King Philip's War. And having said that, I think that this might be a good grade to start to lay the foundation for looking at current events in a somewhat more complicated way. And to that end, we've tried to provide a couple PowerPoints and an offer for somebody that if they want to try this thing out and tell us how it works, and if they want to sit down next summer and just have a conversation about it, I think somewhere inside of all of this, there is a useful lesson. I'm just not sure exactly where it is. So the modern thought question is to make a list of some of the different ways that people describe refugees today, whether they be refugees in Texas or in Ukraine or in Syria or in Hamas or someplace like that. And how many of those different ways of thinking about immigrants are like some of the ways that the Puritans thought about the indigenous people back then? That we're laying a foundation for doing what the social studies are supposed to do, and that is train people to being citizens. So, a footnote: King Philip's War in New England was about the same time as Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia and something called the Pueblo Revolt in New Mexico, where the indigenous people drove the Spanish colonists out. And like I said, the presentation can serve as a guide for the whole class discussion, or you can print the quote cards for individual study and make it a reading activity where their job is to try to summarize what that person said. And up on your website, there's also a map activity to help reinforce basic place names as to where some of these places were, like the Connecticut Valley and Boston and Salem and things like that. And so with that, I will call that one as done and admit that we can't answer the questions right now because the questions are probably a little bit more complicated than right now, unless you've got a real quick one.
We are going to jump into the regions problem, which I'm going to intro and then turn back to Phil. We have kind of a weird order on things tonight, but Phil is going to demonstrate in just a sec a big problem with studying the United States, and it stems back to an activity we did in the previous unit that you may choose to revisit here, where we drew 4 lines to create a map of 6 distinct regions across North America. And if you recall from that conversation, regions are not a hard, fast rule. They're simply a way of organizing things to help make some meaning by organizing areas that have something in common. A great example of this is if you Google map of the Midwest right now, which some of you are about to do, I'm sure, you will see at least 5 different configurations of states making up what we would commonly refer to as the Midwest. And I once had a colleague berate me for using one of these maps that didn't include a state that she was adamant was part of the Midwest. It doesn't change the fact that we create regions to explain commonalities, and Phil's activity in the last rollout is a great one to demonstrate a less common but very memorable way of regioning the United States. So the problem, and Phil is going to get more into this in more detail in just a second, is that almost every textbook that you're going to see out there will refer to several regions that don't always make a great deal of sense from a geographic standpoint. We commonly use the terms the New England region, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies, sometimes the back countries in there. And we're going to use those terms in Giants because they're also going to appear on the M step, and we are ever beholden to, at least for now, how our students do on the dumb assessment. But in the interest of doing your kids a service, we're going to teach them both things. So we're going to teach them those, and we're going to talk more about this over the next few minutes. So Phil, back into regioning the United States.
So what I've got here is a way to review those regions if you want. And I don't know if you've spent much time on the clickable maps. I don't know. Maybe you can even wave at me to say, you have or you have not. If you have not, you can go over here to the button that's called North America Regions here, and it gives you a very quick way to go over that and kind of review what North America was like. You can put the old rock line on there. And then to make it a little clearer as to exactly what it's about, you can add the mountains over there. And you can see all of the major mountain ranges are off to the west of that old rock line. And that the east, these mountains are way much older. They're worn down. They don't amount to much compared to the west. They also don't have near as many metal ores in them and things like that, which will become important later. And then you can add the forest and farm line to this, and then maybe put up something like conifer trees, especially in December, because conifer trees are what we call Christmas trees, the little triangular shaped things. And you can see that most of Canada consists of that kind of coniferous forest. People haven't cleared it to make farms because it's just too cold up there. And then you can add the tree grass line and then put on the grasslands, and you can see how they're nicely put out into the middle there if you want. and the deciduous trees that we've got over here in eastern North America. And you can finally add the cotton corn line here to show that it's kind of at the bottom end of that group of the trees that change color in the fall. And that south of that, you get the pine trees of the southeast. Um, like I say, it is another way to get at it. There's also a basic geography of the United States that has got a couple useful things on here too, like the growing season, which in effect is your cotton corn line. And when you look at the large plantations, you can see they're all south of that, that the corn belt is up a little bit north of it. In other words, you can use that map, and then I'm hoping that you went out at least once to look at the US in the late 1700s. And there you can put on, the growing season I've got over here somewhere. Um, well, you can put on individual crops like indigo, rice, tobacco, and so on, and talk a little bit about the complexity of the economies back in those days there. You can also look at where the slave population was and find out that by and large, in the early stages, slaves were brought in for the tobacco plantations because tobacco took an awful lot of work. And we'll talk a little bit more about that after the break, a little bit later on. Like I say, there are three different clickable maps up there that you might find useful in your fifth grade class to either introduce some ideas or to make maps that you can print out and hand out to the students to draw on or to make parts of their notebooks. Or you can use them to review ideas like the big 4 lines that we can divide North America. So, like I say, I was going to try to introduce the clickable maps a little bit here to help as background for that region question. So with that, let me turn on a slideshow and hope you can actually see a slideshow about the regions.
You're good, Phil.
We're good. Got it. So you've got that slideshow back then. In the handout set for this time, we gave you just a couple maps to say it may well be that it's a good idea to divide the United States into regions, but you ought to know that our federal government has divided the United States into at least 16 different kinds of regions. And on the back side of that page, we've got, if you go down to different websites, these are the states that would be put into the Middle Atlantic region by different websites. So what Dave was saying earlier, that we might talk about the middle colonies, but in fact, if a student is going out onto the website and looking at different history channels like learning.com or like Shepherd Software or so on, they're going to find different groups of states that are called the Middle Atlantic states. And in fact, there is no one state that is in everybody's group of the Middle Atlantic states. So it's a tricky balance that your M-STEP test does name a particular set of states, the Middle Atlantic states, but that just happens to be their choice. It doesn't happen to be, well, I'd say it here. Just because they're mentioned in your GLICs, let's not try to give students the idea that there really is such a thing as middle colonies. Remember, we drew 4 lines to divide North America into a Western mountain region, a Northern cold region, a Great Plains region, a Southern cotton and pine region, and a Great Lakes farm region. And then finally, a Central America hot and hilly region. That works, and I trust if you haven't done it yet, you probably should do it because it'll give your students a little better background in their brain in order to look at some of the other maps that we're going to be looking at. Remember back when I was showing it to you, I said, you can use that to help you understand where the immigrants from Germany chose to move after the Civil War. And we showed you way on the first day a map of what is called ultisols. They're these hard, red, infertile soils. And if you draw your lines on them, ultisols happen to form where there's more than enough rain for trees and a 200-day frost-free season. Now, why would this be important? In eighth grade, it's important in fifth grade because we're laying the foundation for eighth grade. In eighth grade, they're going to add yellow fever and hookworms and a whole bunch of other things to that. For right now, let's just put a couple numbers in the back of your brain because it's going to be a part of the story all the way along. Average corn yield in 2023, last summer, was 138 bushels per acre. That was a new record for South Carolina. On my farm in Wisconsin, I would call that a crop failure. Here in Michigan, you've got a little bit more rain and the soil is a little bit sandier, so you don't quite get that, but you still get 170 bushels per acre average for the last 10 years. Illinois gets 220 bushels per acre. There's a take-home message in this that we ought to communicate to kids that in the very early days of the colonies, when people were just growing food for themselves, malnutrition was a serious problem in the South because you work just as hard to plant a field that only yields 130 bushels as one that yields 220. And in fact, that 130 is with modern fertilizer, modern seed, and modern pesticides. Back in the colonial days, they would be lucky to get 10 bushels per acre because they had no fertilizer, they had no pesticides, they had no machinery to do the weeding for them, and so on. Malnutrition was a big problem in almost all of those areas that have got that kind of soil on them. And that's a message we need to have. This is where environment has a huge impact on history. Cotton needs a long growing season. So you can't grow cotton except in the South where we've got the hot and rainy climate that makes ultisols. So I'm going to say growing season, ultisols, cotton, bad yields, malnutrition, slavery, Dixie. All of these maps are similar because there's a causal connection that goes through all of them. Does that make sense? And with that, we put on the website a handout and now a brand new PowerPoint that Dave loaded up about 2 hours ago, right, Dave? And the brand new PowerPoint includes an activity about how much work does it take to grow corn or cotton. And it has 6 different steps in it. Now, the Cotton Mather story that we did a little bit earlier was a cross-link over into reading. This one is a cross-link into mathematics if you want to. You can actually make a little mini math lesson out of this. You start out with the fact that the soil is different. In the north, the soil is black and crumbly because it freezes up here, and that kills the microorganisms that would decompose all the leaves. And those dead leaves and so on in the soil make it soft and crumbly and easier to work. Now, you can tell me that your garden has got some hard soil in it, and I will nod my head and I will say yes. And then I will say that I spent 4 years living in the South trying to plow this kind of stuff. And you don't know what the word hard is until you try to put a shovel into this red clay. So let's just say this would be about twice as hard to plow. Then the fact is that it snows in Michigan, but it doesn't in the South. And you are in Michigan, you know what snow looks like. But snow and frost help to break the soil up and make it easier to plow in the spring. So that makes it, again, another twice as easy. Then we're going to plant these 2 crops. And you need about 10,000 corn seeds per acre. You need about 20,000 cotton seeds per acre. On the top, you see what a corn seed looks like. It's nice and hard and separates easily. On the bottom, you see a cotton seed. It's all hairy and it sticks together. It's about 5 times as hard to plant cotton as it is to plant corn. Then the plants are going to grow, and corn grows up real tall and it shades the ground, and the weeds can't grow underneath. Cotton doesn't do that. So you're going to have to chop weeds for about 3 months in cotton and only for about 5 weeks in corn. So let's say weed chopping is going to take you 2.5 times as long. Oh, yeah. And then we've got to harvest the crop. And corn, each one of those 10,000 plants has got 1 or 2 ears on it. So you've got somewhere around 10 or 15,000 ears of corn. Each of the cotton plants has got between 15 and 30 cotton balls. And remember, there were 20,000 of them out there. So you've got something like, do the math, something like 600,000 of those cotton balls to pick for an acre of land. And then you've got to take that crop and process it. And with corn, you just kind of peel off the husks. And how many of you have peeled off the husks of sweet corn? You know, you can just talk from personal experience. How long does it take? 5 seconds? 10 seconds? Cotton, you've got to pull 32 seeds out of that cotton ball there. And that will take you somewhere between, well, what they found out is that in a good day, somebody could pull the seeds out of about 2 pounds of cotton. What's the bottom line is very simple. If you tried to grow corn in both places, your children were going to be malnourished because your yield was going to be less than half what it was up in the north. So they pretty soon decided that they could not be yeoman farmers living on their own land and not have problems with a lot of extra work and malnutrition. So the South tended to turn toward these cash crops, but cotton takes somewhere between 30 and 200 times as much work per acre as corn does. And when that happens, you're probably going to want to have slaves. And that's part of the reason that we think it's important, even in 5th grade, to explain that it's kind of the environment that pushed the South into an economy that then made it harder for them to work without slaves and made it easier for them to justify slavery. I'm supposed to stop here for a break, but I got about 1 minute left, and it's only going to take me 1 minute to do what I was supposed to do for 10 minutes after the break. So if it's okay with you, I'm just going to go ahead and finish this thing out.
Do it,
We've got
Phil.
we've got a map activity for you about the early slave trade. And what it literally is basically to give students some basic place location. They know where New York is, where New Orleans is, where Cuba is, and so on. And their only job is to take the numbers from the table down at the bottom of this activity and write them up on the map. And then talk about a little bit, why that might have been the case. So I'm going to zoom in on the map, and I'm just going to do a few of those like this. Like 211,000 slaves were brought from Africa to South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. In other words, to the cotton and tobacco and indigo and rice south. 22,000 were brought to New Orleans, to the sugar plantations there, because sugar doesn't take quite as much work as cotton does, and because that was later, and they were actually buying slaves from South Carolina and so on when the cotton fields kind of wore out. Interestingly enough, 27,000 slaves were brought to New York. In other words, when we were bringing slaves to the United States, we actually brought more slaves to New York and New Jersey and New England than we brought to New Orleans and Mississippi and Alabama. Think about that for a second. Then take a look at another number. 779,000 slaves were brought to Cuba. 1 million slaves were brought to Jamaica. More than 1 million slaves were brought to the little bitty Windward Islands out here. And you might just want to just ask why that might be. Maybe not for your kids, but for your own knowledge. Slaves were brought to the United States with the expectation that they would be families of slaves and they would have children and they would just keep growing. When people brought slaves to the islands in the Caribbean, where there's no frost, and that means there's nothing to kill fungi, bacteria, disease organisms, and so on, the average life expectancy of a slave in those islands was 2.5 years. In other words, they brought the slaves mainly just as temporary workers who they expected to die in a couple of years, and then they're going to have to bring some more. And that is underscored by the fact that nearly 5 million slaves were brought to Brazil. So that's a little mini activity that you could do if you want, or at least have in the back of your mind that the word slave even meant different things in different places, depending on what crops you were growing at the time. So the big take home message from what I just did is that agriculture in the South was not really rich, fertile land like some textbooks say. It was crappy land. It produced half as much corn as a farmer would get in the North. And when you tried to grow cotton, it would take you between 30 and 200 times as much work per acre to try to grow cotton. These are huge regional differences, and they're going to affect us all the way up to the Civil War and beyond. And with that, I'm done about 2 minutes over time, but I don't have anything to do after the break.
All right. Well, we are going to take a 5 minute break, and I'm going to pause. All right. I want to confirm you can hear me because I switched back to the mic that was causing the problems earlier. I think I got a thumbs up from Phil. So, all right. Well, let me share the screen here. So you should be looking at fourth grade, I'm sorry, fifth grade, unit 4, lesson 2. And like I mentioned in the overview this morning, this is where this is where we sort of dial in on what life is like in the various colonies. And we're not walking you through a lot of those things because they're relatively self-explanatory. And like I said before, we kind of like to keep the networks going based off of the things that sometimes cause a little more confusion. And while this next one doesn't cause any confusion, I wanted to highlight one person in particular, because one of the things we like to do in Giants is to showcase some of the stories of people we don't normally think to talk about. A great, for instance, every fifth grade curriculum known to man will at some point talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Ben Franklin, who's my personal hero. I want to be him when I grow up. They're our founding fathers, and they're awesome people that are deserving of being studied for a lot of reasons, but they're also human. And we also like to tell stories that don't always get quite as much attention. And Ona Judge is one of these stories. Now, you're going to notice that we have a YouTube link that I'm not going to make you guys watch tonight, but this is a great one to share with your kids. And then we've added a reading and worksheet, and I called this one AI assisted. So, what I mean by AI assisted is I took a reading that was far too much for a fifth grader, and far too big. And I ran it through Chat GPT and said, simplify this for a fifth grader. And there were some changes that I still made with what it came back from, but this is probably a little more, closer to their reading level. And it still spit back something that was about 12 pages in length. So I went, okay, let's make this 1 page. And it shot it down to about this. And then at that point, I wrote some questions to go along with it. So That's what I mean. You're going to see AI assist pop up throughout all of these units as we add some additional pieces for you. And it's my attempt at utilizing, the work smarter, not harder philosophy. What you will see, and this is some of the source material that it came from, which is coming right from the White House Historical Association, is this big long, and I linked it in the Giants unit for you because it is a really cool story if you wanted to read the whole thing yourself. But I've sort of consolidated it and brought it down, and we're going to switch microphones again because it looks like my voice is going in and out. All right. I'm going to keep this chat window open, Karen. So if I'm still coming in and out, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to assume you can hear me just fine now. So, in the 1700s, there was a girl named Ona Judge, and she was born into the world of slavery at Mount Vernon. For those of you who don't know what Mount Vernon is, it's the big estate that Washington, our first president, lived at. And her mom, Betty, was a seamstress, and she worked primarily sewing and making clothes. Her father was white. His name was Andrew Judge, and he was a tailor from England who worked for George Washington. And Ona's mother was a slave, which meant that Ona was born into slavery too. And when she was just 10 years old, she became the personal maid for Martha Washington. She was a very skilled seamstress in her own right. She helped Martha Washington with lots of things, sewing clothes, general household organization. I guess she was kind of the Marie Kondo of her day. Hold it close to your heart, and if it does not bring you joy, get rid of it. I made that last part up, but she was renowned for her seamstress abilities and her organization skills. She was very good at her job. She took care of Martha Washington very well. She was known as being very kind and a very extremely hard worker. And when Washington became president of the United States, one of the final activities in Giants is this activity on where do we put our nation's capital. And with Washington being the first president, we didn't really have a set spot. So he ended up living in various different cities, and Ona went with the Washingtons everywhere they went. They went from New York to Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia, that's where Ona really got a chance to see the city. She got some nice clothes, and she was treated very well, but it never changes the fact, and this is the thing that we point out in eighth grade as well. There were plantation owners that treated their slaves very, very well. And the Washingtons, generally speaking, treated their slaves well. But just because you treat a slave well doesn't change the fact that they were a slave. And that's an important thing to point out. So the Washingtons were not known as being, horrific to their slaves, but they still owned people, which we recognize is not a good thing. So Ona made the tough decision that she wanted to escape. She didn't want to be a slave anymore. Like many enslaved people that we study in US history, she heard that she might be being given to someone else. She did not want that to happen. So when the Washingtons were getting ready to go back home to Mount Vernon, she left. She packed her things and left quietly. The family was having dinner. They didn't think to look for her until much later. And she escaped. And she had friends in Philadelphia who helped her do this. She ran away to live in the city with them, but she knew she wouldn't be able to stay there forever because she could still be caught and made a slave again. So this time she fled to New Hampshire, much further away. She wanted to stay free. She met someone there named Jack Staines. He was a sailor, he was a free man. They had children together. She was definitely feeling free, but she knew she wasn't completely safe. People from where she used to live found out where she was. Washington and others tried to bring her back, but she refused to go. She wanted to stay free and live with her family, which I think we can all recognize is where everyone should be. So even though she was legally considered a runaway slave, she found happiness in New Hampshire. She learned to read, she became a Christian, she got support from the local community, and she lived there freely until she passed away in 1848. She lived a very long time. That is, if you're doing the math in your head, 17 years before the Civil War. So she lived a very, very long time. And her story ends up showing us how brave and strong she was. She made the difficult choice to run away, knowing that she could be caught and severely punished, but she did it. And so this is a story that we give you some resources to highlight with your kids, because we do have some standards that deal with what life is like for free slaves and enslaved peoples. And this is a great story to sort of showcase, one of those lesser known people from history. I'm not going to share the video with you guys tonight, but the video is linked there. It's good for kids. It was, it's a good one to show, to showcase alongside of her story. And I'm hopeful that the activities that we provided for you there, um, excuse me, will capture your kids' interest and capture your kids' heart. So definitely take a look at the Ona Judge story. And again, I've linked the longer version in the teacher notes, and we've got our AI assisted version in the student notes. And I just gave you the brief rundown of what that looks like. So, any questions on Ona Judge? You guys are the trooperiest of troopers tonight. So I'm going to get into our final piece here, our town hall simulation. So I taught eighth grade US history for nearly a decade. And one of my favorite things to do was to assemble my own curriculum. I loved working on the Giants project from the standpoint of I love curriculum work just in general. It's one of my favorite things to do. And of the resources that I had assembled to teach my eighth grade US history curriculum, there was this really, really, really cool town hall simulation that sort of goes in with some of the colonial experiments with self government that we talked about. It was set in this small town in present day in a nondescript area of the country that was allegedly going to allow a new seaplane business to open in town. And residents of this town attended the town hall meeting and either spoke in favor of or against this business opening, and gave the residents an opportunity to hear arguments either way. And once everyone had their say, they would vote on whether or not to allow the seaplane business to open. I don't know where I got the activity other than it came with a textbook resource kit. I'm not even sure it came with my textbook resource kit, but we beg, borrow, and steal from anything that we can beg, borrow, and steal from. And I loved doing it each year. My eighth graders loved doing it each year. And when we started developing the fifth and eighth grade Giants units, I wanted to do this activity again, but copyright permissions, I could not do that. So I love creative projects, and I took all of those materials and I built an original one, which I'm presenting for you here in Giants. And I believe this one is we're still in lesson two, perhaps. Okay, maybe it's in lesson three. Either way, it's in the lesson and everything that you need is in there. And I'm just going to give you the quick rundown of what you'll do with your kids because this is a really fun simulation, and I hope your kids really get into it. So the first page of the document is all teacher notes. You're not going to print it for the students, but you will print the remainder of the packet that's there for them to look through. And the simulation takes place in a place called Concord Park. And this is what I wrote about Concord Park. Concord Park is a small Midwestern town that was once home to many families who worked in the larger city just north of them. Over the past 20 years, however, as the cost of living has risen, many families moved out of the area, and many of the small businesses that had once occupied spaces on Main Street have closed down permanently. This has caused the population to dwindle considerably. Some people own property on one of the two large lakes and the large river. The vast majority of these people do not live in town permanently, but are there for most of the summer months. Some people live in homes just behind what used to be the thriving Main Street area. Many of these homes are low income, and the people who live there are working several part time jobs to make ends meet. And there's another group of people living in the area who are elderly folks who have lived in that area most of their life. Their homes are paid off, but many live on a fixed income of their retirement savings and Social Security. So here's the big dilemma. Concord Park Public Schools are in desperate need of repair. You're probably thinking which school district is not in desperate need of repair. But Concord Park has this issue. And what they really need to do is they really need to demolish their existing school building. There is too much wrong with it. It's going to cost way too much money to fix everything that's wrong with it. It is actually cheaper to tear it down and replace it with a brand new structure, which will be more energy efficient. It'll actually be heated in the winter and cooled in the summer. Allegedly, up here, a lot of districts cut costs by turning the heat off after like 10 a.m. So like you're good to go in your morning, but as the day goes on, it gets colder and colder and colder. I taught in that school. So the original K-12 school building houses over 700 students at all grade levels. It's well over 100 years old, and in some places the roof is caved in. It's caused some classrooms to be unusable. Many in the district have gotten creative with the use of the remaining space. It's not uncommon for high school students to be changing classes at the same time as the kindergarten, first, and second grade students are headed to one of their enrichment classes. No injuries have occurred yet, but many feel like it's just a matter of time. I don't know if any of you teach in a building that houses all three grade or all of the grade levels in one, but this is a real issue for a lot of schools up here. So yep, I see you nodding your head there. So yep, it can be a real issue. So the new school building would include wings for each grade span to help keep some of those age groups separated. The part-time residents are against a raise in their property taxes. So the people who own the lake houses and the river houses, they're already paying property taxes in the area where their summer homes are, as well as where they live for the rest of the year. So students who are sorted into this category are going to be against raising property taxes to build the new school. They sort of feel, some of them do feel that a good school is a point of pride and support the change, but a good chunk of them do not. The year-round residents, many of them are also against the tax increase. They're living paycheck to paycheck, like many of us are, and they're having a hard enough time making ends meet. Others, including many with children in the school, feel that the increase is necessary for the safety and security of their students. So, if students end up in the year-round category business, they have the opportunity to either choose being for or against. So there are 6 roles spelled out on the third page of the resource material, and those roles are the mentor texts for students to use to craft their character and their arguments. What's great about this is class time. You're going to introduce this to kids and you're going to help them build and develop an argument. So, Elizabeth, you are one of the elderly people who are living on a fixed income. You're not, you don't look old. Don't worry. Don't get a complex. But you're going to be, for example, you might be in that group. And so you're going to develop an argument either for or against based off of your perspective. And everyone's going to do this. Um, and you get to encourage kids to not just develop and refine their arguments, but you're not doing this simulation in one day. You've got at least a day of prep work where they're going to build their arguments and figure them out. Then you're going to send them home and encourage them to have some fun with this. One year, I had all the old fogies, as we called them, decided to show up dressed to the nines like they were in their 80s. One of them had a walker. They found some wigs and some vintage clothing. It was fantastic. So it's one part civics, one part language arts, one part speech and drama. And I promise most of your kids are going to have a lot of fun with this activity. On the day of, you are more than likely going to have someone who was not there on the first day. And rather than have them try to punt and develop an argument, have that person be the town manager who runs the meeting. There are some specific instructions for the town manager. It's great. Then you get to sit back and watch the wackiness ensue. And at the end, you'll lead the students in debriefing. And we give you the following questions. Was this a fair way to decide the issue at hand? Why or why not? Can you think of some better ways that you might decide this issue? What might those be? Um, if any of you ever watched Gilmore Girls when it was on, this is like the town hall meetings at Stars Hollow, run by Taylor. And, everyone who wants to, only in your case, everyone has to, but everyone gets a chance to speak and talk about this. And then the whole town votes, and then you move on with your lives. So this is one of the colonial experiments with self-government. And I really like this one. And so it was a lot of fun to build this for a fifth grade audience using the original thing as a model. I can tell you, I have had every year I looked forward to this activity with my eighth graders more than any other one. And sometimes they were duds, some not duds, but sometimes they came in and they didn't get quite as into it. They didn't show up in costume, and that's totally okay. You are helping reinforce this language arts concept of developing a claim and supporting it with some evidence, and then you've got your speech and drama pieces in there. So if you wanted to add more time to your day, guess what? You can introduce this in language arts and then work on it again in social studies if you're in a self-contained classroom. And then your administrator will come in and be like, look at all this fun you're having. And you're like, yep. And I'm not just hitting my social studies standards, I'm hitting my language arts standards as well. And they're going to be like, you go, you go. So if I have one homework assignment for you between now and our next one at the end of January, it's to hopefully find the time to do this before our next meeting because I really want to hear some fun stories about how it went. So, this whole simulation is in the Giants lesson. and it should be everything you need to teach it. And I hope that you guys have a blast with it. So, any questions over this before we bring it home for you tonight? Okay, well, like I said, in lieu, I didn't do three breaths, but I watched both of you go, nope, nope, nope. So, in lieu of going over the assessment, because it's a similar thing, you'll find the assessment in the Google Drive and you'll be able to give it to your kids. In lieu of going over the assessment, I'm giving you guys the gift of time and a half an hour of your lives back because, you guys are here the final week before Christmas break. Again, I don't know what I was thinking scheduling this one tonight. I appreciate you guys for being here. Thank you so much. And I hope that you guys have a fantastic holiday break, that you get some time to watch trashy TV, read a trashy novel, eat all the cookies, and just enjoy time with your family and friends, and recharge, sleep in, drink the coffee, read the book, do it all. You guys are fantastic. You guys are teaching the children of tomorrow, the people who are going to rise up and be great leaders. And I want you to have a fantastic holiday break. So thank you everybody for your time and attention tonight. And Phil and I will see you and we'll do the thing your kids think is so cool. See you next year. Have a good one, guys.
Merry Christmas.